I'm Bianca.
And I'm Grant.
And this is the Lake House Project.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Lake House Project. As you may recall, last week we started raising the floor. We had some floor joists, some of these spacers, and also we tore out all of that drywall ceiling. So this week we actually started by taking out all of those nails from that drywall ceiling, and then we got back to raising up the floor.
Alright, so I just cleared off the rest of this area, which is what we need to raise up. But before we can start raising up the floor, I want to first sweep it, get it all clean, as well as we need to go back through, find any creaks, and screw down this older subfloor into the joists with some screws so it doesn't creak anymore when you walk on it, which we would have to do before we start putting up the new floor. You want to make sure the foundation is good before you start building off of it. So let's get to it.
I was able to order all of my supplies online and have them directly shipped to my house. This includes a lot of liquid nails for the subfloor, some structural nails and screws, as well as a caulk gun and some joist hangers. We also have Advantech plywood for our subfloor. And lastly, I got a hand planer. You'll see that come in handy later. Here you can see just how squeaky that floor is. Barely putting on any pressure, and it's very, very loud. So what I did was I took some screws and screwed them directly into the floor joist beneath, and now, no creaks. Once we got that foundation of the floor nice and solid, we went on to raising up the floor. And here I'm sighting the board, making sure that we pick one that's not extremely warped and as straight as possible, and then we use the table saw to rip it down to its final height. These smaller areas definitely take the longest as there's a lot of measuring, and I also had to go around a air vent, but eventually we got it all in place.
Alright, so we're about to start nailing in all of these boards of this section, and to make sure that they line up with this top plate, or the bottom plate lines up with the top plate, and we can't put it directly on top because of this notch out over here, we're using the laser, and it might be a little bit hard to see, but I've lined it up on the left, or I guess from your perspective, the right edge of this board, so right here, and then down there as well. And then I've made a mark on that board down there to know that that board will be perfectly in line. Then I can measure 16 inches off of that to get all the other measurements, and that way all these boards will be perfectly parallel and straight. All right, so this board here is a little bit bowed in this direction, and therefore these are all cut to the right length, although there's still a gap here. And in order to fix this, I screwed a screw right here, and then I'm using a crowbar and using that screw as leverage, and then I can push it flush, and then use my nail gun or put some screws in here just for the time being, and then everything sits nicely and square. And as we did last week, we added some blocking in between all the new floor joists to keep them nice and straight. And here you can see just how unlevel that old subfloor was, and so we used some shims to fill in those gaps. And now onto the final floor section. We used the straightest boards we could possibly find, however no boards are perfect, and so here's where we used that planer to plane down the boards so that everything was nice and level. And here I'm giving a nice and long explanation as to how I'm using that laser level again to line up all these joists, but we don't need to hear all that. After determining where that laser level fell, Bianca then marked out 16 inches off center from there to make sure all of our boards are nice and straight. This was another one of those tricky sections with a lot of measuring. I'm a visual guy, so I drew it out and then marked out all my boards. This made it really easy, and then I was able to get all my measurements nice and accurate. Still having to work around one of those vents, but we eventually got it. We then finished off the section of flooring with more blocking, and once this was done, the floor was extremely sturdy. Alright, so today we are going to start laying the subfloor on top of these boards. We're going to use some subfloor adhesive as basically a glue, and then we're going to screw it in with subfloor screws, and we're using Advantech plywood, which is specifically meant for subfloors, and it has a tongue groove on it so that the pieces can kind of lap together. And so yeah, we're just going to have to cut around a few openings here or there, but let's get started. Right on.
I've never worked with Advantech before, however, I really enjoyed working with it. It was very easy to cut and it was extremely sturdy. And this first board I had a lot of cutting to do as I had to go around a bend. And if you can't get enough of this DIY content, we also have a TikTok and Instagram at Golden Key Design for more real-time updates. Now back to the video. After checking the fit and made sure everything looks okay, we added some subfloor adhesive and then dropped the subfloor right onto that. Then it was on to screwing it in. It was then onto the next board, and as you put these side by side, you want to make sure you're leaving about an 1/8 inch gap in between the boards as well as around the perimeter. And then in the next row, we were able to put in a full sheet, and as you see here, I'm adding some of that subfloor adhesive into the groove of the tongue and groove system. That way when these boards come together, they're nice and strong. Then using a sledgehammer, we were able to seat the board into the groove of the other. If you guys are enjoying the video so far, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a like, as it definitely helps the YouTube algorithm and allows me to reach a bigger audience. And also, if you haven't already, please subscribe. We have new DIY videos every single Saturday, and you'll be able to stay up to date on our progress on this lake house. We've got lots more content coming your way, so stay tuned. And then with one board at a time, slowly but surely, the floor was coming together. Come on, that clip was so satisfying. But on a serious note, if you want to do any of these types of DIY projects yourself, I link all the tools down in the description. And once we got the hang of this, it was pretty much a rinse and repeat.
Pretty well lined.
This piece was a bit tricky to fit in here, and especially to lock in that tongue groove system, but I used this crowbar to kind of push it into place. And here we had to add some additional blocking for this vent, and I couldn't get my nail gun in there, so I just used some screws to do that.
So we're on the very last board, and this is where the router actually is. The cable comes up right around this vent. I rerouted that so that it came out in the corner so it was just less conspicuous in the room. And also, I figured now's the time to run the Ethernet cord if I want to, since after this cord goes in, it's gonna be very hard to get through to the basement. So I routed a Ethernet Cat 6 cord that will plug into the back of the router and go straight into the basement. And then from there we can route it to a TV or whatever we need, internet for, a computer, whatever. But it's better just to do that now than do it later, so I just ran it. Even if we don't use it, it's just better to do this. So it's gonna be a little bit tricky with the glue because I got wires here, and so I'm gonna try not to avoid dipping those into the glue and also put the board in all by myself. But this is the last board, we're almost there. Let's do this. All right, the board's in. I'm just gonna use the hammer to pull it back into the tongue groove. This is how many screws I had left. Maybe about 10 out of the 1,000 that I ordered. We did it! Super pleased with the result. Really happy with this Advantech plywood. I haven't used it before, but it worked really well. It's super strong, very easy to work with, easy to cut, and the tongue groove works really well. And it's super nice that it has the layout for all of where your screws need to go. You don't really need to think about it. You can just screw. And it actually went a lot faster than I thought. In total working hours, I'd say this is roughly 16 man hours, 2 days work. I intended to do it over multiple days since it was kind of part-time here and there. But there's a few little squeaks, but it's only because I'm specifically listening for them and trying to make it squeak. But this is way ahead of what the old floor was. Every time you'd walk, you'd hear a massive squeak, and now it's pretty much perfectly quiet. And we still need to add cement board and tile on top of this. So it's gonna become even more rigid, and I think if there is a little bit of squeak now, it's probably gonna be gone by the time we install the final tile. But as you can hear, it's pretty much extremely quiet. I can barely hear anything. So let's move on to the next section. I'll see you next episode.
Next week on the Lake House project, we finally cut the hole for the new staircase. Things are finally coming along, and we're making some big progress, so stay tuned. And as always, thanks for watching and happy building. See you next week.